So, hey, thanks for coming on to the channel, Grigori Karpin, right? Is that
right?
Yeah,
get that right? Grigori Karpin
okay.
Or Grig. You can just say Grig. Everybody does.
Great, yeah. I'll keep it a little shorter, just so I don't get too tongue-tied. But I did a quick intro, but if you want to just introduce yourself, like what are some of the big interests that you kind of focus on with your SCPs?
So at first, it was very like historic kind of gothic horror. If you read some of my earlier articles, you can definitely tell that I studied archaeology in my undergrad. I'm like a big fan of the ancient world and kind of mysteries involved with that. The longer I've written, the more I focused on like character development and examination of psychological issues. And also more recently in the last couple of months writing SCPs that are very focused on like social commentary and I mean just 2020 was rough for everybody and you know it was like a good way to like exercise some of those demons, watching people march on Washington and being disgusted and you know, God, well, I just want to talk about some of this stuff and it's like, oh well, you know. So I think you said you read 5889.
The radio one.
That was the first one where I thought, because before that I had left, you know, other than being informed by my politics, my writing never directly addressed progressive stuff. And then with that one, I just decided, oh, screw it. I'm just going to write whatever the heck I want. You know, I'm going to have a radio host yelling at some yokel about how their conspiracy theories are ridiculous. So.
I definitely, like, that's what my mind went to. I immediately thought of, like, the fear-mongering, like, you know, conservative media and all that stuff.
I mean, that one is specific, you know, it's a radio, which has always traditionally been kind of a spreading, before podcast and YouTube was where, like, you know, right-wing thinking was being blasted out, whether it's, like, preachers or whether it's, like, weird hate-mongering. And, you know, if you look at that one's Amnestic, which I wrote with Disadrun. It's each one of the little breakouts, and they're really short, like little vignettes of radio programs, like a talk show and a sex therapist and etc. And they're all like recorded at a specific spot. And if you look, and if were you to Google those places, they're very conservative places.
Oh yeah, I remember, like, for example, the map with the radio one. It was all like Midwest, that whole strip.
Yeah, with little dots here and there on the east and west that are like very conservative places. So people have been like, "Well, did you have that in mind?" Yeah, it wasn't an accident. But so that's kind of my thing: horror, gothic horror, and then no matter what, when I write about somebody experiencing something, whether it's about, you know, a tentacled horror or a magical spooky radio show, I'm always kind of trying to think about how somebody actually would react or feel or how would that develop in terms of trauma or, you know, experiences. I find if you're not writing about somebody that is like relatively real, whether it's yourself, which comes out a lot, or people that you know, then it just comes off as shallow, and I'm not interested in being Michael Bay. So,
yeah, that's a fair point.
I mean, I'm not saying Transformers wasn't fun; it kind of was, but I didn't feel anything about it. So,
yeah, 12-year-old me was a huge fan. Sure, can't say the same anymore, though.
I mean, wow! Look, Optimus Prime is a big old robot. That's it. That's the end of the commentary.
So actually, I kind of noticed that. So just full disclaimer, I only read the first 3 of your series. That's okay. I'm gonna butcher this. Vikander-Kneed.
Yeah, pretty close. It's almost phonetic, which is rare for Greek. And I have regretted naming it that since the moment I chose. I do know how to spell it without spell check now, though, which is very impressive. It's Hakan Cherries. Hecaton Cherries. And it's the 100-handed. It's in Greek myth, which is funny because there's no Greek myth attached to this series, but it's thematically relevant. In Greek myth, originally when Zeus was fighting, you know, to become king of the gods and everything, he and the other gods were fighting the Titans. If anyone ever played God of War, that's what it's about, right?
Yeah.
Well, not the newest one, but whatever. And some of the Titans actually joined up with the gods. Some of them being the many-handed or the 100-handed, which are horrific monsters. They're fantastic.
They're one of my favorite ones.
Yeah, they're great. They literally have 100 hands and like 100 heads, and they're just nightmare fuel. And I just thought it was thematically relevant for the story I was telling. So yeah, there we go.
Yeah. But I read the first 3 in the series. And even in those first 3, I could see kind of your slow moving more towards like the psychological character based storylines. So I guess as a quick synopsis, the first one, 4612. Now I really like that one because I'm a huge Bloodborne fan. So it kind of really fed into like a lot of the things I personally love. But that one basically takes place or investigates this like occult sacrifice or offering that happened in a 18th century like manner. So some like rich, he's like a mining, like a metal.
Yeah, he's like an industrialist.
Tycoon. Yeah. But he basically, and feel free to correct me. I'm not as, but he basically finds in these letters, they find these letters where he's talking about trying to like kind of make humanity ascend and to kind of gain political power for their great empire. Well, he was English, right?
Right. Yeah, which I chose very specifically.
Yeah.
Because, towards the end of the 1700s, the English were, first of all, that's the reason I chose it was because that's where the Industrial Revolution, most historians agree. I mean, it's kind of debatable, but it kind of started, especially in the northern parts of England. And so that's why, but then also it's like, that's like the ascendancy of the English empires right around that time. So it was appropriate.
Yeah. I mean, it ended up becoming literally the empire that like the sun never sets on. So I thought that was pretty fitting. Yeah. So anyway, they basically try to, I'm trying to string it. How about you take over? But basically what I'm trying to say is that like, basically they find this alien like thing after it. So this is how I interpret it, actually. I'll just point it out. So basically there's a talk of this meteor that crashes on his estate and people never find him again. So there's like a lot of these rumors. And then in the letters, when the psychic agent kind of like recreates that what went down. Basically, how I interpret it is the meteor contained that alien creature.
No.
The second one, right?
Right. So So basically, it's about Eckhart, and the manor is called Eckhart House, which is his family's traditional home. And they didn't find the alien inside it; they called the alien. Essentially. So
they summoned it.
There's an older skip. I think it is 3467, but I might not be right. It's called the Rite of Solomon, and it's this fantastic thing about how it's this horrible like magical ritual that if you get all the right pieces to, you can summon God, kill him, and become God. Like essentially, that's like the most vanilla reading of it possible, but that's basically what it is. And I always loved that, and so I thought, well, what if somebody got their hands on it, but like didn't really know what he was doing? I mean, like he's an occultist, but he's just a rich asshole, basically. And he's got all these other rich assholes around him, and they're the Yorkshire, Thaumaturgical Society, and they are going to call down this thing that they think is holding humanity back. And they're not wrong, actually, because there is something there. And it is this thing that's been around for a long time, at least according to the historical records the Foundation has found. They can kind of make these connections that there was this thing that would show up, and maybe it had something to do with the Deva going away, and maybe it had something to do with the Black Plagues, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think Eckhart, I mean, his motivations are bad. He just wants more power for, white people. Let's not kid ourselves. He's an English guy in the end of the 1700s. But
white man's burden.
Yeah, he's not a good person. But he thinks, humanity needs to rise up and be, which sounds like, something like Ayn Rand would like or something, and like you can get kind of sucked in and seduced by this idea of, humanity, Tony Stark, right? That's it's technology. And there's this thing, let's, for lack of a better word, alien slug god, who has been holding humanity back. And, in sort of accidentally, these magicians kill it. The meteor is its son. So it gets really pretty strange because this thing has been around for a long time. And at some point, though you have to read between the lines, it decided it needed to have like a human agent or somebody that would be, a sun-like figure or a, some sort of avatar. He's a separate person, but he is essentially sort of this middle ground between this, eldritch horror type thing and a human being. And he basically, it's basically the Foundation finds it and doesn't know what to think about it. It's incredibly dense, the body of this thing. It's been there for 300 years and yet isn't putrefying. It's just in the basement of this famous house that no one knew about because the door to the basement was essentially invisible because of magic or whatever. And, it sounds much more fancy in the article, but it's magic or whatever. And then while trying to figure it out, they have a psychic, somebody. And this is a real thing. Well, okay, wait. It's not a real thing, but it's a thing that people believe is real, which is psychometry, I think is the way to say it. And it's basically, you could touch this quarter and know who had touched it in the last... I don't know, 36 hours or something. I don't know why you'd want to do that. But, and I had, I was just kind of reading about like what people thought about psychics. And I went, oh, that's kind of cool. I don't want to like communicate the dead, but like, what if somebody could touch something and tell its history? Well, that's actually a great storytelling device, which I thought I would use in multiple articles. And though she's still around in some of my articles, I don't do it because I feel like, well, I did that already. And so she tries to get a reading on the body. Nothing really happens. And then she decides to kind of, what the hell? Let me try something else. And, this thing was ritually sacrificed. And so it's still got this slit in its, belly. And she puts her hand in the wound. And then not only does she see what happens, it's like it's like a projection. And so even the director who's there can see it. And that's how we as readers get to see it. And so instead of it being, an endless series of journals, which I, even on my first article, I was like, I'm not doing that. Because it's just sort of a trope. It happens all the time in articles. I, wanted to go kind of, what if there was just a camera there and we saw what the psychic saw? And so, that's, and I don't want to give too much away about it, but basically it's this, it's the massacre. They come down there. When the Foundation goes down there, they see this dead alien thing and like dozens of human bodies and go, what the fuck? What happened here? So it's like CSI, but like magic cult version.
So read it if you want to find out.
Yeah, I mean, the ending is... the reality is all the conflicts happened 300 years before the Foundation finds it, but it becomes very real because they're feeling it. And by the end, it becomes pretty concrete that this human slug hybrid thing, who looks like a human, but has a real... I've been... Sherm, who I know you've had on here, told me he thought he got real, like, Dr. Manhattan vibes from him, which I was like, oh, thank you. That's very touching. He wears more clothes than Dr. Manhattan, but he's still around because he kind of pays a visit by the end. And my thought process was I could do a series about these things, and I have, but I haven't. It's been kind of this, where can we touch on these different concepts in different ways? But
so I haven't finished the series, but from the ones I've read, that like I guess I'll just call him the Dr. Manhattan slug guy.
So we can call him. You read 5512, the one about the cult, right?
Yeah.
So I usually call him Marquez because that's his like pseudonym in that
Diego.
book. Yeah. So I usually call him by his last name just because it's easier than calling him his designation every goddamn. He's SCP 4612-beat. Now fuck that. I'm not.
No. I kind of viewed him more as a like there's more to. So obviously there's more to him because I haven't finished it, but I kind of read it almost as like he's more of a morally neutral character. Like he seems much more like a force of nature and less of like an evil god. But at the same time, so with the passages, he kind of was talking about like how he was left all alone by the by these they're not gods. I'm forgetting the name. There's a prime.
He calls them the prime movers.
Prime movers. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're other things like the dead slug god, essentially.
Yeah. Oh, so they're actually not the same like race.
No, they are.
Okay, they are.
They are. But yeah, he calls them prime movers because, you know, in those passages in 5512, so just a quick rundown, 5512 is about a UIU, which is the FBI's version of the Foundation, essentially, doing a sting because they find out about this cult that's starting to gain steam in Boston in the 90s. Oh, all my shit's like set way like 40 years ago, and I have no idea why, but it is. Well, mostly because I don't want people to have cell phones and supercomputers.
Yeah, it's an easy way to avoid that.
Anyway, it's Boston, and it's like 1991, I think, or 92, and the UIU finds out about this cult, which seems to be kind of small, but also seems to know stuff they just shouldn't know. Like they seem to be in on the weird anomalous stuff. And so they start doing a sting, not sure what exactly is going on, but if you lived in this world, in the Foundation's world, and you knew anything about anything, you know that like cults that actually know stuff, well, it can get in a lot of trouble. Like there's a lot of stories about that and how dangerous they can be. So it starts off as a sting. They put in like, an undercover agent, somebody they've like blackmailed to go in there, and things go very, very badly. And the Foundation kind of picks up the pieces because I forget his name, but the U.S. attorney or the attorney general,
Douglas is the director.
Calls in, says, "Hey, look, the FBI screwed up, and come bail us out." And in that thing, while they clean up that situation, they also find some of the cults, like not Bible, but their ideological tracks. So that's the passages we were just talking about. And I, in some ways, I use that to kind of help expand, because the thing I hate doing is like exposition dumps. But like also like you want to do a little world building, like who are these slug things and who is this guy? And so I read a lot about cults for like 3 weeks, which is really, they're very disturbing. A lot of weird shit happens. So his speech that's being heard by the undercover FBI agent in there, where he's talking to his flock, is like really modeled after recordings of the dude
I can tell.
Jonestown. And I mean, I didn't copy what anyone said, but like I had the transcript for like, what's his name that ran Jonestown, his last recorded, it might even be something Jones. Anyway,
I think it was.
And like, David Koresh in Waco and stuff like that. And I had like transcripts of their speeches to their followers, and like really tried to model his speech afterward. And like people that have had experiences with like kind of cult like stuff in the past have told me that story has like triggered them before, and I'm like, well, I'm sorry, but also thank you. I guess that means it's really accurate.
But yeah, I got like huge Heaven Gates vibes from that, because I listened to a whole podcast series kind of looking at the beginning and end of Heaven's Gate.
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely can say, like, I've heard the recordings of Heaven Gates, like the 2 leaders and everything, and I'm like, yep, this is like spot on.
Yeah, so 5512 is definitely very inspired by like cult stuff, and I just use that as like, because I mean, hey, creepy cult, that's fun, and it's also a trope that's on the site. There's a lot of but it typically just centers around, oh, there's a cult and they're trying to call some evil god. And instead I was like, well, what if there's a cult, but I just use that as like talking about cults and how fucked up they are. And so yes, I do a little world building, and there is some more you get a little bit more of a window into the series, meaning who is Marquez, is he the same guy that's been around for 300 years? Because in that one, I don't say yes or no. It's very much implied, but people afterwards were like, is he, or is that connected? And I'm like, Yes,
Yeah, I wasn't sure either. Yeah.
Obviously. But yeah, the psychological always is like super important to me in terms of the storytelling. Like what, if you, even for him, because he's, like you said, he talks about in the passages about being alone, and he is this thing, he's human, quote unquote, he's got a human mentality. He was probably born human. I don't know. I haven't really wrote his origin because I don't care. Who cares?
Oh, okay.
Who cares? He doesn't have a Uncle Ben moment. But he was a human at some point, whether he was a baby or not, when he got, changed, but he's been around a long time. And, I think he thinks he's doing good stuff. So I don't think he's like amoral. I think his morality is very different than ours because that's
what I was trying to say.
He is really trying to protect his flock and do what's best for them, but it's not what maybe you or I would think is what's best for them, because he's doing like medical experiments on them and trying to make them into better things, which has done, spoilers, does eventually work out for these people. But like it didn't for the first 3, because when the Foundation finally gets in there, there were 3 observation cells that just have like fucking mutated corpses, and weird stuff done to their lymphatic systems with alien tissues like injected and surgically implanted and whatnot. So, so from his perspective, he's trying to elevate the human race. His father, or whatever you want to call that dead slug thing, was very concerned with humanity too. Only it was like an angry parent who was always telling, stands at your door and tells you, why isn't your room clean? Right? We all had those conversations with our dad or mom. And, our parents meant meant the best when they were concerned about teaching us to clean up our rooms or, take a shower or whatever. But the way that they approach it isn't always, the best way for children. Yeah. And I took that same mentality. And is he actually in the morally right? No. But he does actually think so. I mean, the best villains think they're the heroes in the piece. I mean, I don't give a shit about Thanos, but Magneto's always been pretty fascinating to me.
No, I agree. Yeah. I mean, so that's what I was trying to say earlier, is I feel like you could actually really kind of hear him out and like kind of see like this guy himself. I don't think he, like, if I was in his position, I don't know if I would be that differently than like how he's kind of going about things. I
mean, we know for sure he's been around and alone for the last 300 years or so. And it's implied that he's been around for a lot longer than that. And for a long time, he had this, mentor figure, as he mentions in the passages, which is his dead, eldritch horror godfather. And how do you, if your experiences are that alien, but you just want to create a community, how do you do that from scratch while also, trying to live up to what your father instilled in you, which is very strange ideas about, and it's, you think that guy sat down with the slug and had tea? I mean, like, their conversations probably were pretty weird and alien. So, I always am trying to think about, like, the thing that we talk about, like, if you read like vampire novels or like the old Highlander movies or whatever, these things have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Are they really still human? Like, are they really going to think the same thing? Of course they're going to have, they still have the brain that we have, right? Even if they're a supernatural undead, they're probably going to have something close to a human personality, but like, I bet you it's going to have some pretty negative consequences living for a very long time and watching, I'm only 40, and like, when you lose your parents or your cousin or whoever, that's already devastating enough. To imagine living through like 20 lifetimes. No, that would suck.
I immediately think of the film Diary of a Vampire with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise.
Oh yeah. I mean, that movie doesn't really hold up that much, but like it's very 90s pretty boy. But that one kind of is. I always kind of was like, oh yeah, that would be kind of shitty. Like, also, I don't want to drink blood. That sounds terrible, but but also, like, hey, you want to live forever? Hey, yeah. Well, okay, but there's a couple of caveats.
Yeah. So like we kind of talking about it earlier, but to me, there's like Bloodborne all over this series, especially like the medical experiments and the whole like theme of trying to ascend humanity, and even the theme of like the old gods that have kind of always been involved in human history. Because for people who aren't familiar with Bloodborne, kind of the premise is basically that there are these old gods, and basically a bunch of these like Victorian-esque like scholars find, or archaeologists find these tombs, the Marian tombs, and they start like using the old god's blood to treat like miracle cures and things like that. So there's a lot of threads between like...
That's my favorite part of that lore, is that they find like the bodies of like ancient, what is equivalent to deities, right? Because they're like biological entities that have crazy supernatural powers that no one could understand. And they're not gods the way that like Jesus or Zeus was, but like, kind of, they're gods. And I just love that the idea that somebody was just like, I think it was Lawrence probably was the one because he started the healing church, right?
Yeah, Lawrence the first, And
he decided to like take a syringe and drain some blood and then be like, hey, let's shoot this up, guys. It's really fucked up. But yeah, Bloodborne is a huge inspiration for me. I read a lot, spoiler warning, I read a lot of Lovecraft when I was a kid. Like a lot of us did, and a lot of, I think, people on the wiki have probably, because strange fiction, weird fiction has got a real certain je ne sais quoi that, really has always been, hey, what is this thing? Well, it's not a vampire. It's not a werewolf. That's boring. It's, an alien. It's a dead alien. But is it dead? And whatever. But as I grew older and I started to learn more about Lovecraft and what kind of person he was, and Google it at home, kids, but his name for his cat isn't exactly pleasant. He was a very, very racist man. Very racist, very anti-Semitic, which as a Jew, I'm not a big fan of, obviously. And it was hard to, I don't know, like it's hard to, he's such an incredible influence on my life and my writing, but then at the same time, like, trying to like understand who that person was and why he thought, unnatural horrors in the dark were scary was probably because he didn't like people with different skin colors, which is really, really horrible and sad. And I like that Bloodborne in a lot of ways kind of tries to like, it doesn't expressly do that. Like, I wouldn't say it's a political game, but there are some like political, like, there's some very specific through lines in that game that are about like classism and like religious oppression and xenophobia. I mean, like, so no matter what character, class, or what, not that those matter in FromSoft games anyway, but I mean, like, you could be a knight and you're still the guy. You could be anybody. It doesn't matter. In Bloodborne, I think everyone is canonically a foreigner. You've come to Yharnam because you have some sort of disease. It's never said, and people are being treated in Yharnam by what they call blood ministration. No one knows what that means. Is that like 100th part of every bit of blood is like from an alien god? But it's supposed to be a miracle cure, and your character as the foreigner comes, and everyone that you run into there, well, there are a few nice characters, but mostly everyone's initial response is, oh, get out of here, you foreigner, you stinky foreigner. And I kind of like that Bloodborne in a lot of ways tries to address a lot of the weird problems with Eldritch horror, to kind of discuss, and that's definitely where 4612 came from, was this discussion of how do, I still care a lot about Eldritch horror. I still like it a lot. I still find things like, like The Void, which is a dope movie, or The Endless, which is another one. Very, very compelling. This idea of like nameless entities that are very interested in humanity, but that like aren't, old white men with beard, but some other kind of gods that I don't know what that means. Like, they're not interested in worship. They're gods because they're just more powerful than us. And so kind of, how can I still tell a story about that sort of thing, but also talk about stuff that matters, like the consequences of industrialization, or what is morality, and what is actually caring about other people, actually mean, and so that whole series, I mean, it goes places, but it is very much to do with that. It starts from a very gothic horror perspective, but very quickly I decided to take it out of that era. And that's why I made it about the FBI investigating a cult, in the 90s, all of a sudden, because it was okay, it's not just about old, British magicians. It's, there are new age cults too that do this. And, and also I wanted something for myself. I think a lot of people come to the wiki, and I deal a lot with critique. So I know a lot of new writers, they come to the wiki, and there's so much lore, and there's so many different, groups of interest and interesting, weird history to the foundation. And they just think, well, I'm just going to add to this. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's great, because I have read tremendous amounts of stuff on the wiki that I love that isn't necessarily that original, that is taking somebody else's idea and growing it. And that's great. But the first thing I wanted to do was kind of carve out my own corner of the wiki. And so it's not like a canon in the traditional sense on the wiki, but it is very much like a corner. I made my own site, and I did my own weird thing with, it's kind of hard to describe when people are like, well, what's that series about? Well, it's psychological, historical, gothic horror, sort of. Bloodborne is important, and so is Freud, and so is, I don't know, a lot of shit. There's a lot of influences on the series.
Well, yeah, I mean, is it still ongoing? Or is it pretty much?
Yeah,
okay, so it's still.
Let's see. The most recent. So there's the most recent one. I just uploaded on the 13th. So it is. I think. How many do I have now?
There were a good amount.
Yeah, there are. Yeah. So it's 1, 2, 3, 7. So yeah, there's 15 articles. And I'm sorry. I promise it's worth it. But yeah, so the first 4 are SCPs in the more traditional sense, and then I kind of started trying to do tales more, just because the SCP, I really like the challenge of the limitation of the format of SCPs. It's really fun thinking about, okay, this has to be from the Foundation's perspective. How would they have heard about it? And how are they going to examine the problem and not solve it? Because that's never really about what the SCPs are about. It's more just about cataloging it. But if you think about it from a perspective of what is this file going to contain? That's a really interesting, creative limitation. I really enjoy it. But also, you don't get internal monologues, and you're not just going to have a half page of dialogue between two people. You can do it in an interview, but if it's just two people talking about their feelings, I mean, you can push that format, and I have, but sometimes you just got to do some prose. And so I have some fans of the series that have just read the SCPs because it's cool, and it's just a bunch of weird horror type, or horror adjacent, let's face it, it's not really scary stuff. And then, if they want, if you read the tales do kind of connect the dots in a lot of ways, because it follows like the psychic is in the first 2 of the ones you read. And something pretty bad happens to her in the second one. And not in a she's dead or raped or something, but in a she has an experience. And the thing that always bums me out about reading a lot of these SCPs is I don't know, and I don't care who these people are in the MTF that are dying or experiencing something horrible, because they died or they're nameless. They're Alpha Bravo 2 or something. And I kind of started pretty early on. The first one doesn't even have an exploration log. It just has 2 people chatting, and it turns into a psychic broadcast. And the second one does have an exploration log, but, pretty quickly tried to just, I'm not going to worry about giving people weird designations. And if somebody isn't a captain in the MTF, well, they're going to come back later, because I imagine the Foundation doesn't have endless military trained, magic,
Yeah.
People that are aware of magic, that know how to use a rifle and are also good at strategy. Like, I imagine that person's pretty useful.
Yeah.
Not to say people don't get hurt or died in my stories, they do, but and so I kind of always want to talk about, what would that be like? And so if somebody goes through something and doesn't die, probably at some point I'm gonna write a tale that even at least addresses it, because I'm just interested. Like, I even wrote a tale about the immortal cult guy way back in like the Greek era, because I was like, I haven't really told anything from his perspective. It's always been some outsider looking in because he's an alien intelligence. So, but why not tell a story about when he was younger? And it's not an origin story, but it's fun to examine the psychological side of the SCP stuff.
Yeah, I personally love like tales that kind of go on the other side of the perspective.
Yeah. I always found it really interesting to be like, when a tale is not, I'm not here to like dump a bunch of lore. I'm here to just say, okay, what would this actually feel like? So like my co-writer on one of the other things I've been doing lately is this project called Vikander-Kneed Technical Media. And it is, it was my excuse. There's other cursed media on the site, but I wanted to do kind of my own feel for it, because, who doesn't love Candle Cove or something like that? I do. That's fun, and cursed media is interesting. But I wanted to tell some more socially responsible, not socially responsible, but like progressive or social commentary stuff, but mixed in with like being unsettling. And that's where the radio show won, which is 5889, I think. Yes. And my co-writer is writing a tale about it, which is not the secret history of the radio broadcast. It is about a housewife in the 50s who overhears a broadcast. And that's the kind of tale that I'm, interested in. Like, I'm interested in reading, if these horrors are in the real world. Yes, the Foundation tries to like, hide them and put them in boxes, but like the whole point of it is, before they find it, it's out there. Or there are lots of these things that are containable in the sense of like, we can cover it up, but it doesn't mean you can actually put it in a box. And it's much more interesting to read about like, oh, well, what would this be like, whether that's from an MTF or whether that's a researcher, or even better, give me a civilian, give me somebody who is, just like me, or just like my mom, or just like, my neighbor who runs into 106 or something, and it's just like, not just a horrible torture porn Ed Grimdark bullshit, because I don't care about that. I care about, horror is cool because I think horror, like comedy, is oftentimes trying to push the boundaries of, social norms. Sometimes in ways that are like a little uncomfortable. And I, even that radio one, a lot of people have told me they find it pretty unsettling in parts, and that's okay, because I think that horror's purpose is to sort of point out the things in society that are just, kind of screwed up, or, like if you look at those old Jason movies, right? Friday the 13th, they are just schlock, and they are just people getting stabbed in campgrounds. But also there's like a lot of really interesting commentary about like, kind of social norms about like premarital sex in the 70s, and people are like, oh, it's just an excuse to show nudity. And it was. Let's not kid ourselves. but I also think that horror always attracts like those people that feel like they are the rebellious, the socially marginalized. I'm a huge Clive Barker fan. And if, first of all, everyone should go see Hellraiser. That movie holds up. It's like 1,000%. 40 years old or something, and it is still just as weird as I can imagine the people in 1986 or whenever that came out in the theater going, what the fuck?
Yeah, that's great.
Because when I watched it on like DVD or whatever, I was like, in my 20s, and I was like, what the fuck is? and it's like pre-CGI, and it's dealing with, you know, some really fascinating stuff because it's, you know, what is hell? Well, are there demons? Sure, there are demons, but like, what if they're demons because they just don't know the difference between pain and pleasure anymore? And then it's oh, this is weird. It's almost sexy, but in a terrible way. It makes me feel really uncomfortable. And you know, when you find out that, you know, the man is you know, he's in, I don't know, I think he's in his 60s now, and he's, you know, very out and gay, but growing up in England, you know, in the 70s or whatever, being gay probably was pretty horrible. And how did that affect him in terms of like how he looks at the world and how the world looks at him? And that's what horror is about. You know, it's talking about us and our insecurities and society, I guess. That sounds really pretentious, but
no, I don't think it does. I mean, like for me, what personally really drew me into a lot of horror and sci-fi, it was just I like kind of with Star Trek 2, although that's not really horror related, but I'll just use that example. I have a weird relationship where a lot of Star Trek stuff, I have a hard time watching it now because I very much do not like episodic stuff, but I do like a lot of like themes that come from it. And I really like the perspective of like an ideal utopic world kind of viewing our world, and kind of really, I always like that like mind or like mental puzzle of like, what do you think the next generation will look at us and think we're like barbaric for believing or practicing or doing. And I feel like a lot of horror, a lot of sci-fi, they really kind of, especially horror, they really kind of either literally or metaphorically kind of have a lot of commentary about like kind of the darker sides of our current society, or even just our psychology and things like that.
I mean, if you look back and read some of the horror that was, you know, famous in, or not famous, you know, famous is within reason. This is a very niche subject, or niche. Is it niche or niche? Anyway,
I've heard both.
Yeah, either way. You know, if you Ray Bradbury, right? There's a famous writer. I think everybody reads into high school. Well, he wrote some pretty dark stuff. Probably not the stuff that you read in high school, but he wrote some stuff that is clearly horror. I mean, I think it was sci-fi. But like, if you read like Martian Chronicles or R's for Rocket or whatever, there are short stories in there that are like, what is going on? This is dark. And a lot of the stuff that he was talking about in those stories about, you know, oppressive ideologies and you know, let's just call it, you know, racism and sexism and all the things that are, still a problem, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that stuff is like really interesting. And, you know, it's kind of poisoned me because I've been reading and watching this stuff for so much that like, if something doesn't make me feel like a little uncomfortable, you know, I'm like not as engaged. You know, and whether that's, doesn't have to be horror, but be challenging, you know, like, I mean, popcorn movies are good. I'm not saying I didn't watch the Avengers. Of course I did, but
yeah.
You know, I don't care. I care about things like, you know, Prisoners, that movie that came out a couple of years.
That's on my list. Yeah, I really want to watch that.
I won't say anything, but it is like, I've only seen that movie once, and it was, God, like 6 years ago. And I remember every moment of it because it is, it's not disturbing. Like, it's not a horror movie exactly, but it's unsettling. And it's like, wow, this is rough to watch, you know, and movies like that matter, you know, Children of Men. Have you ever seen that?
That's on my list too. I really need to watch that one.
I mean, Children of Men is like incredible, and it's so relevant now. And the movie's like 10 years old, and it's basically about us today, except for people can still have babies. Like, this is the only difference. If you watch that movie, you'll just be like, oh, that's just us.
The premise, real quick, from what I understand, is basically like people can no longer have children in that world, or only a select few. And I know there's like something with a child that.
Yeah. So the whole plot, the world plot is that like no one's had a kid in like 17 years or something. And like the most famous person in the world is like the youngest person in the world, who I think at the beginning of that movie is like 18 or 17 or something like that. And it's just nobody's having babies anymore. And there's no like discussion about where that happened. It's cool because they don't waste time with saying, you know, an alien came or a comet flew by or something like that. No, they just say, look, no one's having kids anymore. And why that would be scary. I mean, like, I don't want to have kids, but like, I get why as a society that would be scary. That means
Yeah.
like, oh, well, you're the last generation, us. And a woman who is a refugee from, you know, kind of a war-torn country, and this is in England. It's set in England, which has a lot of problems with well, let's just call it what it is, racism and like politicized immigration and stuff like that. And that this movie plays with those ideas very much so. So she has a baby, and no one's had a baby for a long time, and so it seems like she's pretty important, right? And there's a group that wants to see why she was able to have the baby, and the whole idea is we got to get her to the coast, we got to get her to this boat. And if Last of Us isn't based on this movie, I don't know what it. Like, it's just
Yeah,
it's just a road
Last
trip.
of Us vibes, yeah.
It's like Last of Us came out way after this movie, but it's got, if you've played Last of Us, this is sort of like that. This isn't as like fascinated with like human misery, although there are some parts that are really dark. And that movie is just about us. It's not even sci-fi. Like, if you just like pretend that no one's having kids anymore, you can just watch this as a documentary. It's really upsetting.
Yeah, it's definitely one I really, really, really want to watch. One of the other ones I really liked. So I like a lot of surrealistic stuff. Actually, the DVD right here. I don't know if you know the film Paprika.
Oh yeah, yeah. Satoshi Kon. I worship
Satoshi Kon.
He's amazing.
But to me, that's like in fuck. How am I blanking on the name? It's the one with Leonardo DiCaprio. They go in dreams.
Oh, that's it's Satoshi Kon. Like Paprika
it's like
is
the
like
better version of that.
Yeah, exactly. Paprika is like the much more adult, not adult like porn, but like adult like in terms of intellectualism and like challenging. Like it's like Inception was made for like 12-year-olds, and Paprika was made for the adults who have read books. And Paprika is really cool. It's like an anime, and it's an anime. Yeah. Like there are weird, cool anime.
It goes out there.
But God, there are some parts in that movie that are just like. I mean, that movie's more fantasy, but there are parts in that movie that are like kind of scary.
Yeah, it goes all over the place. Like it kind of has this like tech that lets you go inside dreams, right. So it's got that like sci-fi fantasy with a little bit of a horror kind of stuff, but a lot of it, I'm really rusty, I haven't seen the movie in a while, but from what I remember, a lot of it has to kind of do with commentary on like disturbing desires and like necessarily what you want, like because like a lot of it was like this guy trying to like control people's dreams to like take over the world and live out his personal dream over and control basically at the whim of everyone else's. Your choices, your decisions don't matter anymore.
Yeah, that movie's fantastic. There's a lot of really interesting, like, I don't want to sound like a weeb, but there's a lot of anime out there that is like really interesting and challenging stuff. Like, on the same subject as Children of Men is a movie that came out like I think in '99. I'm not sure, I was still in high school. Called Jinro.
Yeah,
The Wolf
Jinro's
Brigade.
Great, yeah.
Have you seen that?
Yeah,
that one's like, I hadn't seen it until I think like just a couple months ago, and wow, that movie's stressful because it's just about it's sort of like for people that don't know that much about Japanese history, like we dropped the bombs at the end of World War II, which is horrible, for at least in my opinion, and we had a very strong part in playing and rebuilding that country, and this anime sort of takes this concept of like, well, what if we just like really push Japan to be a lot more militant, and they are like very fascist, I would say, in the and what's weird is like the anime, like the narrative never comes out and says they're wrong. Like you just have to be paying attention and realizing, oh, the protagonists are the bad guys.
Yeah.
And it's like at first it's just like, ooh, cool armor. Is it so? Like,
yeah,
it's
there's a lot of Nazi like soldier kind of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I'm sure if I was like 18 or 19 when I watched it, I probably would have been like, oh, this is cool. Like, it's like kind of like mecha armor. And watching it like in my 30s, I was, oh, that's very Stormtrooper. And I don't mean Star Wars.
Yeah, no, not that kind. There's like a whole. I'm not going to spoil anything, but there's a whole kind of plot line between these like rebels who are trying to overthrow this like oppressive fascist government and all that stuff. And there's a lot of like Red Riding Hood kind of symbology going on there and stuff.
Yeah, that's fun.
But I mean, for me, actually, a lot of sci-fi stuff I started with was with Japanese stuff. I started with like Neon Genesis Evangelion. I'm not sure if you know. Yeah. So I think that kind of really got me like really interested in stuff that was much more kind of focused on like psychology, mental illness. Like especially for me growing up, I had a lot of issues with like fitting in and like socializing.
I'm a horror writer on the internet. I think
the cliche.
I get it. Yeah. You make videos. You're an artist. I'm a writer. I 100% get it.
Yeah, I'm not like the others. No. But and then like it kind of really drew me to. So I really dived in a lot with Japanese sci-fi, and then I actually got into Lovecraft. That's kind of late, like high school, because I took a sci-fi English like horror class with an English teacher
in high school.
Yeah, I was really late to the.
That's cool though. Like,
she's a great teacher. It was. I didn't
get to read that shit in school. Like,
yeah, well, that's where I read. So I want to make sure Ray Bradbury also wrote Fahrenheit, right? Fahrenheit 451. Yeah, so that's the only Ray Bradbury book I read in school.
If you only read one, that is the one to read. That one is amazing.
Yeah. As for people who don't know, that one's a whole commentary on like book burning and like kind of repression of like knowledge and all that. And there's obviously a lot of other. I'm really rusty. I haven't read this since high school, but that was the main thing that really kind of. So it reminds me of like the Nazi book burnings and
and I think that's the very surface inspiration. And I mean, when it was written, it was written like not long after World War II, and so we all, I think America and other Western countries had this image of the Nazis. They had these big rallies where they burned books. Well, guess what, guys? They weren't the only ones. We've done that plenty too. But. So in this world, intellectualism is, reading is essentially illegal. But it's not reading in general because they have like the equivalent of blogs and magazines and comic books, but they don't have books anymore. And books are illegal. And the firemen, because all houses are fireproof now, firemen don't have to fight fires. They go and burn down houses that have books in them. And it sounds very cheesy, but that book's pretty impressive because it's not, I think the initial imagery is very obviously about the Nazis and the book burning, but it's really kind of talking about, the preservation of ideas, and like, I don't think people should read books from the 1800s that have slurs in them maybe anymore, like talking about banned books, but like those books should still be around. And like, maybe we shouldn't be reading Tom Sawyer in high school, but I think those books are important. I think lots of books are important. And like, if we got rid of like, let's use a modern example. What's his name? InfoWars guy. I hate him.
Alex Jones.
Yeah. If we took all of his videos, it's not books because whatever, but let's say we took all his videos and deleted them, and everyone else that disagreed with anything progressive, and we burned them all. Well, that's great for the moment, but like if we don't like have those things, then we won't know what to look for with like hate mongering and other stuff like that. When I was a kid, I'm Jewish. I was a kid, and I never wanted to go to the Holocaust museums ever. I refused. I mean, like even watching Schindler's List was like really hard because, for obvious reasons, it's a very upsetting subject. But I did go to one a few years ago, finally in Israel, and there's this room. I mean, first of all, they have all these amazing like horrible Nazi propaganda and stuff that's preserved there, and you can see how like Milton Bradley made a Nazi-themed Monopoly for the Nazi party, like literally branded Milton or Envy, whatever, which is and they've got all that stuff there, but there's also this room where you walk in and at least I did not notice at first that you're walking on glass, that the floor is transparent, and I was there with my sister and she pointed downwards kind of in horror, and there were just like hundreds and hundreds of pairs of shoes. And I mean, I think that's a common image that people talk about with the Holocaust, but like it's another thing to be in the room with them. And it's like, I could imagine people that lived through that that would have wanted those shoes thrown out. And let's not talk about it. It's too harmful. It's too hurtful. And I respect that entirely. But also, if we destroyed all those ideas, then maybe that happens again. I mean, like, to some extent, anyway. Why did we get on the subject from SCP?
No, I think it's really important, though. Like, there's a lot of discussion with my college. So I'm a college grad, but a few years ago I was in college, and we had a statue of Thomas Jefferson on our campus. And there were a lot of people who were debating, like, should we have this statue or not? Because obviously he had slaves. He had most likely a forced relationship on one of those slaves. And so, especially looking at it with not even a modern look, there are people in his time who also kind of knew morally that was pretty irreprehensible.
He did. There are things that he wrote that pretty clearly condemn slavery, and then,
And then, it's
this is the man that wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
That's not a document that seems to be in agreement with, at least from a modern perspective. You'd think that the Declaration of Independence is pretty against slavery, but it wasn't.
Yeah, it depends who you ask. You have Hamilton and other people who are like, it clearly says it's freedom for all men.
But the thing is how do you define men, right?
Person ever. Yeah.
Well, no, Hamilton isn't. But,
yeah. But even in that period, that argument of like the morality of slavery is pretty ambiguous. It's not like everyone was like, oh, slaves are fine, because their abolitionist movement did exist then.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, by that point, and Jefferson, before he was president, even, I think, was ambassador to France or England.
It was France, yeah.
It was France.
Pretty sure.
And at that point, I'm pretty sure they had already outlawed slavery. And so he knew, he was there and liked France a lot, wrote very, very nice things about how great France was. And while he was there, he paid his slaves, because they were servants and not slaves, which even if they were just servants, there's issues with that, in my opinion. So it's not like he wasn't aware. Jefferson.
But anyway, I guess the point I was really trying to briefly touch on, because this is a whole can of worms, to be honest. It's a pretty deep conversation. But my whole point is I like to really see history for what it is and not try to push away the uncomfortable facts.
Yeah.
I am of the personal belief that we can still honor certain accomplishments, but you have to be very aware these people, you can still enjoy. Man, it's so complicated.
I totally know. I mean, I was talking about Lovecraft earlier. It's the same deal.
Yeah,
it's not as important as somebody like Jefferson, but there's and I mean, now every other week we're finding out. I mentioned Avengers earlier, and now it's pretty clear Joss Whedon was kind of a terrible person, which sucks because I used to think that guy made cool movies.
Yeah.
And, I think there's a lot of that where you have to you don't have to decide I'm throwing out every aspect of this person's work, whether they're an artist or Thomas Jefferson or whatever. But you better not be pretending it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why history is important. It's not just to read about, cool Spartan warriors, people that talk about Sparta and that movie 300. That movie really makes me mad because I studied a lot of Greek history, and that movie portrays Sparta as these warriors of freedom, and they enslaved an entire people. There were the Helots, were an entire people that they, as a tradition, treated less than cattle. That were their slaves. They were their slave soldiers. They were slave workers, but then they were also just part of the growing up process. Instead of having a bat mitzvah, they sent out little kids to beat up on the Helots with knives and shit. History's rough. And you don't have to go, well, that was a different time. And it was, right? I mean, there are lots of things where you look back in medieval politics and stuff, and you can't really totally hold it to modern standards, but also we can look at it through what we know ethics are now, and say, well, we don't want to do that again because that was horrible.
Learn from history. Isn't that the point, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point of learning history. Not just because, people with shields and spears are cool, which they were.
Yeah.
Like the samurai,
Hey, real
pretty
quick.
cool.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm a huge history fan. It's not just also because I'm interested in like knowing where I came from or where like literally everything that was around me that exists came from, but also kind of you can't avoid kind of the whole like, I guess this is where like the Star Trek kind of stuff comes in, where they kind of talk about like there's like a macro and micro scale where you can kind of understand human psychology through understanding our history as a whole too. And so I feel like there's a lot of stuff you can kind of personally learn to a degree about your current society and the things that the history that you're a part of right now. Because I think it's important to understand that like the people that lived during the Greek age or the Roman age or the Persian Empire or whatever, they weren't dumber than us.
Yeah.
Like we were all like the same people.
100%. 100%. I mean, like, I studied, in my undergrad, I studied archaeology, and part of that is physical anthropology, which is, looking at the evolution of the different pre-humanoids and whatnot. Well, we've been I forget, like basically the human form that we are now for like a long time, long before Egypt, long before, like we were cavemen and we were basically you and me. Maybe we wouldn't live as long because there was no medicine and we had very rough lives. But, they were just as smart. Maybe they didn't have Shakespeare, but, they had stories and language and community. So when people, it's a problem that early anthropologists really ran into. That they were mostly white people going into other places and seeing, oh, well, these people still have spears, but we have guns, so we must be more intelligent. Well, no, it just means you come from a society that was, happened to have more access to technology. I think that's what's really cool about Star Trek. I mean, one of the things about Star Trek I really liked was this idea of like, if we find people that don't know, I forget what they call that, but if they don't know, Prime Directive. Yeah. If they don't know about spaceflight, we really need to not tell them. And it's not to keep them in the dark. It's because it's not our place to like, inject our. I always liked that because it wasn't like looking down on those people. It was about trying to let them come to their own, history or whatever. Star Trek is cool. I agree. I'm not a big episodic guys.
Yeah.
But the core concepts are like really pretty amazing. Especially because I think, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but like in the historical, they talk a lot about like the early like 2000s, or I forget when they had like their horrible time before, Starfleet and before, all of the Earth became one unified country. And, I at least in some of those, I remember them talking about like, humanity hasn't always been great. Humanity's been real bad. And that's why we want to be better now.
They definitely reference like the 80s. I mean, so like Next Generation was in the 80s. And then you have 80s to 90s. And then you have Deep Space Nine, which is 90s to early 2000s, I think. But they will definitely have commentary about society in the time that it was airing.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool.
I mean, the original Star Trek was what, 64? 65?
Yeah, I think it was mid-60s.
A long time ago. Yeah. And there weren't a lot of black women or Asian men on TV. So even, and I mean, that's a small thing now, but man, that's for representation, that's pretty great. Like, I mean, Captain Kirk was still like a total chauvinist. he treated other people badly, but like whatever, like that show did have in its heart, probably a good perspective.
And I'm pretty sure it holds the record, the historical record for the first like interracial kiss on like broadcasted television. So that was kind of cool. It was interesting. Even for that time, it was considered like very progressive and like out there, that show.
Well, I mean, it wasn't that long before that show was on that it was still okay for some states to make it illegal for you to marry someone outside of your race, which is bullshit. I went to law school, and one of the cases we read is where the Supreme Court finally, and I mean, it was in the 50s. The 50s. Yeah. That's not to say that everywhere in the country it was illegal, but like certain states, probably in the South, sorry guys, had laws that were like, you can't marry, me. If somebody was like a non-Jew, they couldn't marry somebody who was a Jew, or, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that was in I forget when that case was. It might have been 52. But that's only like 10 years before Star Trek. So
yeah,
that's really impressive. I mean, California was probably always a little more progressive than some of those states, but
I remember the court case being like something versus Love, because I think the guy's last name was Love.
That's right. The married couple's last name was Love. That's right.
I'm like, wow.
They made a good movie about that. Well, it was all right, but it had Ruth Negga, who's a really excellent actress. Yeah, we should probably get back to talking about SCP.
Yeah, I enjoy the tangents just as much.
Me too.
Well, so yeah, as a segue, I guess, what are some of those like individual standalone pieces that you kind of really enjoy?
So yeah, we talked a lot earlier about like a series, which I definitely do. But because this is flash fiction, and flash fiction is all about, let's not kid ourselves, shorter kind of bite-sized stuff, I do have a focus on trying to do some sort of standalone ideas. One of those is 5889, which we talked about, which is about basically a series of broadcasts, but they're very targeted radio broadcasts. And it usually is only one person overhears them. And they're able to be recorded, but they have a mimetic effect, which makes you... it's anti-mimetic and it's mimetic because you don't remember the content of the broadcast, which doesn't apply to the transcript, so you could read a transcript of it. But it makes you remarkably, essentially upset. It was kind of commentary because there's a trope on the wiki that is, things that make you crazy. Yeah, and I'm sure you've heard that before, and a lot of your listeners, if they know anything about it, it's just a thing that happens a lot in the wiki, that like you run into a box or a weird monster or a god or whatever, and it makes you crazy. And that's pretty boring. Not because it's bad, but because it's just sort of been done a lot, right? And that's all the way back to Lovecraft. That's, if you're face to face with Cthulhu, yeah, he's scary because he can physically kill you, but also he's scary because just, looking at him will make you nuts, right? And so 5889 is kind of a jokey sort of like, oh yeah, there's this radio show that if you listen, you become like existentially afraid for your existence, but you don't remember what you listened to. You just remember that you were scared. And what's so funny is, and we can talk about this in a second, but I do a lot of the crit. Like I mentioned, I'm on the Butterfly Squad roster. And I'm always telling people when I'm, especially newer authors, like first-time authors, forget about the anomaly for a second. I don't care. Who cares? What is the story you want to tell? And for me, I just wanted to tell a series of like little vignettes about weird radio shows that are like kind of politically commentary. And so I was just like, well, I don't know. Let's make a anomaly that makes you lose your mind for a second. But I've gotten a lot of good feedback on that one, and that one is doing pretty well. Got a lot of comments, actually, like 33 comments.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, normally you get like 5 or 10, maybe.
Yeah. And
comments are great because, don't get me wrong, I love it when people upvote stuff. That it feels good. You spend like, a day writing an article and it feels nice to have strangers on the internet. You do the little +1 or whatever. But the comments really do matter. Like if you, read a story and you're a member of the wiki, if you like it, leave a comment about what you liked, or if you didn't like it, leave a comment about what you didn't like. It's like really engaging stuff. But anyway, that one started a whole, like, it's not even a storyline because I have there's 7 articles now, by a few different authors and myself, about this media company, like I mentioned earlier, Vikander-Kneed, that just does screwed up media, and it's just like an excuse to so I have one about a game show that I wrote with somebody else, and I've always thought game shows were like the stupidest form of entertainment. Like I don't understand why anybody, I just have no idea why anyone would watch it. There's no characters, there's no drama. I don't know what is the point of this. Like I even understand why people watch soap operas. Like I wouldn't, but like at least there's characters and drama. Whether or not somebody knows the answer to a riddle, like I don't give a shit. And it's basically just that for 20 2,500 words, where it's just like mocking the whole concept, but like in really disturbing ways. Like the host is like in a 1950s style like checkerboard suit, but like his eyes are like constantly leaking like black oily tears, and his teeth are bloody, but he's not killing anyone. He just looks horrible, but he sounds like a really disinterested host. Like, even it's supposed to be the pilot for a new game show, and and even then he's just like, ugh, you know, because that's how I feel about them. But 5889 is the one about the radios, and it just is. It was just an experiment. It was just trying to like, let's see what the audience would say about something that was just obviously political. And so, you know, it's supposed to be a radio show that's targeting people's fears, but for the most part, although I think I did include a little spider story in there, so there is an arachnophobia, but mostly the fears that the radio show is targeting is like social fears. And, you know, there's one about, the California governor, giving up his seat to like Satanists in the 80s because of the Satanic Panic. And, you know, there's one about, it's a sex show where somebody calls in. It's supposed to be like a steamy show, but it just turns into her acting like a dom, talking down to this guy and talking about how he needs to beg his job to like validate his, beg his boss to validate his experience, his existence. There's nothing sexual about it whatsoever. Yeah. But her tone is very much in line with like one of those steamy radio shows.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I had a co-author with that, so to be fair. Some of the other ones, the standalone ones, so there was a contest a little while ago for Valentine's Day. And my entry was SCP-3809, and the title was Love in the Time of Algorithms. And it's about a satellite that develops sentience, which I think has happened like twice before on the wiki, so it's not that original. Mm-hmm. But this satellite becomes obsessed with Pastor Joel Osteen. Which I don't know if you know who that is.
No, I actually don't.
Okay, so Joel
is he one
Osteen,
of those like mega church guys?
Right. Okay. Yeah. He is a huge mega church guy in, I think, Austin, and I'm not sure. It's in Texas. It might be Dallas. I'm not sure. So don't quote me. And he has this huge church called Lakewood Church. And he's famous because he's on the internet all the time. And he's one of those types, and very financially successful, which I have issues with. Just the idea that you make millions of dollars just being a preacher seems questionable. But he also became kind of a big deal because a few years ago there was a hurricane. I think it was like 2015.
Oh, this guy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he would not open his church's doors, not even to his constituents, or that's a political, the members of the church congregation. Yeah. So
congregation. Yeah.
And afterwards he said that wasn't true, and there was but whatever, And I thought it would be funny, and it is a comedy article in some ways. That what if this AI was just in love with a mega church douchebag? Because I don't know if I could write like a traditional romance, and that was the theme for the contest, and it did pretty well. I got second place, so
wow, not bad.
But it is like pretty ridiculous because she's like very she kind of does read like an obsessive stalker, but like I try to play it out for like comedy. So like at one point she calls his assistant, and he's like trying to get rid of her because he just thinks that she's an obsessed fan, not knowing that she's like a weird mega computer satellite thing. And he's trying to get her off the phone, and he's trying to end the call, but she's like basically stopping the call from ending. And she says, "Okay, just one question before you go. How dedicated is Joel to the whole sanctity of marriage thing?"
Oh, wow.
And I just kind of like tried to throw in as many things as possible that were like, sort of mocking the whole concept of like these people that are famous and powerful because of morality. Like,
yeah, it's really weird. It's a very American thing.
Yeah. Like, it's like, what if Gandhi, he's maybe a bad example, but like what if Gandhi was like super rich? I don't know. Maybe he was. I don't know. But like, what if he had like millions of people listen to Gandhi on the radio every week because he was such a moral person? That's the equivalent to the mega church televangelists. And I just have always kind of felt like they should be mocked at every opportunity.
Well, yeah, definitely my European friends don't hesitate to like brand that as like American. Like when they think of America, it's one of the things they think of.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you talk to people that like I have lots of friends that live in other countries. Like I have several friends that live in Japan, and they're always just like, oh right, yeah, American and they see like the stuff with like Donald Trump, and they're like, oh, that's what America's like. It's like, okay, it's sort of true, but like it's also not like it's
it depends where you go.
And I mean, a lot of these stories will have kind of a horror or unsettling vibe, but like also kind of a comedic side to it, because I feel like they're like two sides of the same coin. Like, I think the best parts of like, I don't listen to a lot of Night Vale anymore, but like I have like when it was like a big deal. Well, I guess it still is a big deal, but like when it first was coming around, and I always thought the best part about that show and other ones like it was how it could switch between being funny and being like kind of unsettling at the drop of a hat. And that's like the best part about anything is can you make me laugh?
Like dark humor and all that stuff.
Yeah, like black like humor, dark comedies. Why is Monty Python so funny? Like still, like because there are some of those skits, like Holy Grail. There's moments that skits where you're like, oh my god, people are just dying like left and right. Like, this isn't funny, but you're like, I am laughing. I'm very uncomfortable, but I'm laughing.
So check those out. I definitely am gonna check out the Mega Church Satellite one. That sounds like a pretty fun one. But so you briefly mentioned you're part of the Butterfly. I'm gonna butcher the name. Butterfly. I
think it's Butterfly
Squad roster.
Yeah.
Here we go. So what's that about?
So a couple years ago, and I think I'm friends with Place, and I saw your interview with Place, and I think he talked a little bit about the greenlighting process, but I think it was about a year and a half ago. So I'm relatively new to the website, even though I've got like 37 articles.
Wow.
I just it's pandemic. I've just been really bored.
That's fair, yeah.
And it feels good to be creative. But about 6 to 7 months ago, maybe a little longer, I volunteered to join the. It's like I'm not staff because I don't want to deal with that. But I'm part of this group of volunteers that's just for critique. So the new authors, if they want, so anyone can post to the wiki at any time. If I had never had anyone ever look at a story, I could have posted it directly to the wiki. Will that survive? Maybe. I had a lot of experience writing, so maybe I would have been okay, but probably not, because it's a different sort of fiction than it's flash fiction. And like we talked about, there are certain limitations to the format of an SCP. So the best way to go about it is to have someone look at your concept and see if the concept is, is it just tropey? I mean, the thing is, a lot of people come to, and I'm not trying to insult or anything else, a lot of people come to the wiki or the concept of SCP from outside, and the outside offsite sort of fandom isn't aware of a lot of articles because the games or Vulgan or whoever hasn't covered them yet. There are almost 6,000 articles now. Well, and sorry, there are almost 6,000 SCPs. There are almost another 4,000 to 5,000 tales, which get a lot less attention. But that's a lot of stuff, and I haven't read. Even half of it. But so a lot of people will come to the website and they'll have only read, I don't know, 049, or they've only read stuff from DJ Cactus, I'm not saying anything there's nothing wrong with that. Before I was, really deep into it, I'd only ever read Metaphysician, who's the guy who invented sarcasm. Who I'm friends with now, which is really cool. But, so I didn't know anything about anything. And that's true of anyone that's first coming to the thing. And so the greenlight process is, hey, you're a new author. You want to get the more established authors, whether or not that's just somebody who has 3 articles or 20 articles, and you want them to take a look at your stuff to give you critique, to either help with the story or to just tell you what they think about it. And if you want to be able to show the draft, you're going to have to show that you have an idea worth looking at. And so the greenlighting process is, hey, spend 400 words, sell your idea to me. Just give me the elevator pitch.
Oh, okay.
And, they put a post on the forums, and they need 2 green lights from an author that at least has 3 articles or is on the Butterfly Squad roster. So some people have volunteered for the roster that aren't authors that have shown that they know enough about the writing and they've been supervised or whatever. And so, what'll happen is most of the time, there's channels on IRC or Discord where people can approach you about it. But mostly I want people to message me on the wiki.pm and with a link on there for their post. And then I go and look at the idea post. And so they're supposed to be like, okay, here's kind of the layout. Spend a couple of words. Tell me what the layout's going to look like. And most important, tell me what the hook is. What's the hook? What's the central narrative? If the only thing that's going on in this idea post is telling me about all the interesting aspects of your anomaly, I'm probably not going to agree. I'm going to ask you some questions because, it's been a while since Series 1, and we as a community have evolved. And if it's just like an entry in a D&D monster manual, that's not going to work. Maybe sometimes it does. Sometimes something is so just different and original, or has just an interesting tone, or it's very funny or whatever, that it does work. Yeah. But most of the time, it's not going to work. And so that's why earlier I think I said, you should not worry about the anomaly. Tell me what the story is. What do you want to write about? What is it you care about? It doesn't matter if it's just a funny story, or you want to talk about your grandma, or it doesn't matter. Any story is relevant because it's all human. We all can all relate to something that you've experienced. Trust me, as different people as everyone is, there's something that we can relate to, whether that's, your struggles coming out of the closet, or, your struggles just going to school or whatever. And it's very common that people are young that are coming to the wiki for the first time. Yeah. And so that's all, good. But the point is to try and people look at it like gatekeeping, and I guess it's not totally wrong, because the greenlighting process is sort of providing a threshold, but it's not intended to keep people out. It really isn't. It is intended to help people out, because it's very common that someone will cold post something to the wiki and then it gets downvoted to deletion within less than a day. And that can be very discouraging. And then maybe we lose somebody that would have been the next DJ Cactus. Totally possible. There are new authors that have come out in the last, year, like myself. No, I'm just kidding. That are that have come up with really truly original stuff that, had they just cold posted, or if they had been discouraged, maybe they wouldn't have kept writing. And so the idea is to kind of give a new author a bit of, it seems like gatekeeping, but it's really about, hey, here's why I think this idea might not work, at least in its current form. And I'm always trying to be super constructive about it. And I think you'd be kicked off the squad pretty quickly if you weren't being constructive about it. And I also do critique a lot on drafts, but that's just, looking at a story saying, hey, this part's kind of boring, or the most common thing is, hey, so all that dialogue you have in the middle, you should read that out loud. You should read it out loud. And if it seems weird to you when you read it by yourself in your room, I'm going to think it's weird if I'm the reader. People think that's the strangest advice ever, that don't write.
Works.
Oh, yeah.
But it works so well.
This is the oldest trick in the book. Shakespeare probably did it. You read it out loud to yourself. It sounds weird to yourself, but if you're like, wow, that guy sounds awkward. Yeah, that's because the dialogue is awkward. And it's something I really, try to focus on, is character and dialogue stuff. So, I'm not the best at spelling and grammar. I'm fine. But I mostly rely on other authors that are my friends that are really good at that stuff to look over my stuff to make sure there's no errors. Thank you, Harry Blank. But I'm always focused on like story structure and flow and character work. And, I think it's very easy to think that this idea or that idea is like really edgy and like really trying something new without realizing that 40 people have already done that on the site. And so my biggest advice, other than don't worry about the anomaly for a second, tell me what the story is, which is always the most important. It doesn't have to be a novel. It could be 200 words. Well, that's pretty short, but it could be 1,000 words. It could be a very short article, and it could still have narrative. It could still have a story, some sort of arc with a climax and a resolution. That doesn't mean people always ask, well, it's a resolution. I don't explain everything. Well, that's not what a resolution means. It's not, here's what happened. It's, how is it different? A story should be, we start here and we end here. What's changed in that path? And the biggest thing that I'm always trying to convince people to do before they try and write for the wiki is read on the wiki.
No, seriously.
Because we never covered this, but I discovered the wiki really late. I'm 40. I discovered it at 35, which is, I think, uncommon. There are some others that I know that are in their 30s, but I think a lot of people I talk to, I talked to a lot of people I talk to are in their 20s at most, or they're teenagers, which is cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But I was like, it was the year before I started law school, and I was just stressed out of my life, and I was on Reddit, and I forget where. I was talking about how there's just like not a lot of new, interesting, like eldritch horror. It was some conversation where I don't remember what subreddit it was. Fucking Reddit. And somebody was like, "Oh, did you know about SCP?" And I was like, "No, what's that?" And so I never had that moment of SCP real, because I was in my 30s, but. But I was immediately taken with the format. I was immediately like, oh, I get why people like this so much, because it has this verisimilitude. Is that the right word? Where like it feels real, even though it's not realistic. Like it feels like a government or some weird organization made these files. And I think my first one I read was something by Metaphysician. It was one of the earliest sarcasm articles. And I went,
cool.
What? Yeah. What is this horrible body horror, David Cronenberg? This is great. And so I got sucked in pretty hard from that. But even so, my first idea, which 4612 is my first article, thank God, so far I've never had anything deleted, but
nice.
I had to do the green light process. I'm a new enough author. I started in November of 2019. It was a relatively new process at that point, but I didn't know anything different because I didn't join until 2019. Like I just read stuff for years.
Oh, okay.
I would just like look it up on my phone and be like, oh, cool. And I would always see the little ads that popped up and be like, well, that's weird. What do you mean sign in? You can be I never worried about it. And then after I graduated law school and I had more free time, I kind of thought, well, why don't I join and try my hand at writing an article? And 4612 looked nothing like it does now. I mean, it was about like, it was kind of a ripoff of like Hellboy and BPRD at the beginning. Like, I mean, it was about like a group of like World War II vets who like find an abandoned bunker, and it's literally the corpse of the like Abrahamic god and stuff. Like, and you can see the core ideas of where that started, but like, it was because I talked to like other like, well, at the time I was not an author, not really, but like more established authors that went like, hey, I don't mean to be harsh, but like, I don't think this is going to work for your first article. You're going to talk about literally the god of like Abraham dead in a bunker. I mean, that might work, but something tells me that like the first thing you write on the wiki shouldn't be quite so, insane in scope. And that's another thing that people run into a lot is, oh, well, I have this story about this thing that shows up and it's going to end the world. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, we've seen that a little bit. What I would suggest is like, let's take it down a notch. Like, the first step I think a lot of people take with anomalous effects is, it makes you crazy, or it makes you into a murderer, or it kills you because it's just, and then they drown themselves. What if, like, I just did one, and I won't say who I was looking at, but I was just looking at a proposal for a new idea, and it was a pretty cool idea. And actually it was a draft for something. And it overall was very interesting. But one of the things that happens is that if you were to be exposed to this thing, you get very obsessed with like the ocean. And the first thing I thought was, oh, that's fascinating. So it's like the sailors stuck at home, or the sailors' wives being like looking out to sea. This could be really very cool. And then they drown themselves. And I was like, whoa. Why don't we just stop right before that? What if the people that are affected by this anomaly, just need to be around the ocean? Like they just feel a compulsion to move closer to the ocean, whether that means living in a shack or whatever. And and that's going to ruin your life because because you can't stand not staring at the ocean for 10 hours a day. It's just as devastating, and it actually is more interesting because we haven't seen it 1,000 times.
Reminds me of almost like cordyceps, where like once you're infected, it makes bugs want to go to the high ground.
Oh yeah,
on branches and things like that. Yeah,
isn't that because like to avoid like flooding and stuff?
Yeah, I think it's more so. I think the wind so it can carry the spores of the
right,
fungus.
It's a mushroom. Right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Speaking of mushrooms, actually, I have like a fun mushroom SCP.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the standalone ones I mentioned to you before. It's 5079. And it's about, and I wrote that about a month into the pandemic. And I was really feeling the isolation. And it's about this guy, kid, whatever, who's really lonely and who wants to just connect with other people, and thinks the best way to do that is like through magic or like ritual, right? Because it's the SCP. Shit's weird. And he goes on to like IRC and like talks to like weird, like, dark web magician people or whatever. And he gets turned on to like a ritual that is meant to like bring people closer together. Well, it's actually like weird Sarkic stuff that's meant to like create like essentially like melding people together. And so, and he's supposed to do it with other people, and he just like puts it out on the internet. And so it just like makes people like slowly turn into like these bloody like fungus growths. And I got to really mess around with like body horror. Like when they find him, he's just like growing, like you can kind of see where the body was, and he's just like growing up the side of the wall.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I like that.
Fungus growing out of people. I don't know. There's that Hannibal episode.
I immediately think of like when I was a kid, I ran into some like weird people online who like.
No, you've been weird people online?
I know, right? Whoa. Through the Homestuck fandom, there's this one person I talked to who was like really getting into like the hyper new age stuff, but also mixing it with like Moses and like Abrahamic religion stuff. And it was very much like it had that like supernatural, like I know the true nature of God and like magic and things like that.
10 to 1, that person thinks the world is flat. He's one of those people, right?
Probably now. I wouldn't be surprised.
He's like, look, if you look at this camera, you can tell that there's no curvation to the world. No. Yeah, but I mean, actually, it was a long time ago, but I studied anthropology, and part of that is focusing on folklore and how there's like syncretism and how ideas like merge together, especially of a religious nature. So it sounds silly to like take Abraham and mix it with new age stuff, right? But and it probably was. This person probably was being pretty silly.
Well, he also threw in like Thoth and Egyptian mythology too.
Of course, it's new age. Yeah, of course Thoth was in there. Of course.
Yeah.
People have been like recycling Thoth forever. Like it's so funny because the Greeks did it even though they weren't Egyptian. And they didn't believe in Egyptian gods, but they were like, ooh, Thoth, he seems cool. And then like Aleister Crowley talked a lot about Thoth, and it's like, dude, what do you mean? Are you worshiping Egyptian gods? No, but Thoth, he seems all right. He's like the god of knowledge. Yeah, all right, fine. But like that is like what I mean. It normally just turns into cults, but sometimes like religions. I mean, like if you look at Christianity, and I don't want to offend anybody's religious ideas, but like if you look at Christianity and the ideas, that's just the idea of it. It's not a natural evolution of Judaism, but like you can totally see how whoever who came up with a lot of these central tenets certainly was growing up around, people that believed in Judaism. And it's probably pretty clear that they were around Zoroastrianism as well. Like, it's also true if you go all the way back. I just watched, I don't know why I watched it, but there was a movie that Aronofsky did about Noah.
I actually haven't heard of that.
Do you know Darren Aronofsky? He's the one that did Pie and that horrible drug movie. What was that movie called? Yeah,
Working for a Dream. Black
it's not
Swan.
horrible. It's a good movie, but it's really horrifying.
It's disturbing.
Yeah.
It's disturbing.
So he did a movie about Noah, like the ark and shit, which is hilarious to me. That the
was
guy
this recent?
I don't know when it was. I think it was like 2016 or 2017.
Oh, yeah, that's probably why I don't know about it. Yeah.
But he's made a lot of good movies. Like, I thought The Fountain was really cool, and The Wrestler is an amazing movie. And so I thought, hey, if anyone can make Noah interesting, it's there. No, that movie's not good.
Damn.
It's just a movie about fucking Noah. Anyway, but like, if you look at that story, the Sumerians had a story that is almost exactly the story of the Great Flood. Yeah. I mean, and the Sumerians, we know from archaeology, were around a lot earlier than the earliest, what we could identify as like the earliest Jews. So I mean, I wonder if they got that story. I mean, that's how syncretism works. Is you take like that person who was taken home stuck and New Age and Abraham is smashing it together is probably just trying to figure out his life. But that is weird how those ideas. I mean, shit, even for fiction, right? We just say, I like this, and I like this bit, and smash it together.
And even for me, it's not even conscious a lot of times. Like, there was one like personal work I was writing on, and I was realizing, wait a sec, this is like Half-Life 2 meets Bloodborne meets like these other things I've been reading. Like, where is this coming from?
Like, I mean, you're not the first person. I mean, Sherm, I think, when we chatted about 4612, and he was like, have you played Bloodborne? and I went, I have. Oh, you know what? Yeah, that does seem to have a bit. Like, I didn't even know. Like, I didn't even think about it because it's not explicit. But also somebody shows up in like a tricorn hat. And come on. Yeah. That's very Bloodborne. I never would have thought tricorn hats were cool until Bloodborne.
Yeah.
But yeah, those ideas, they get in your head. I mean, I'd probably never intentionally try to write a story that's exactly like Clive Barker's, something about Pinhead, but like, let's not kid ourselves. A lot of those stories I've read all of his books. His imagery has gotten into my head at some point.
Yeah.
I mean, Lovecraft, if you go back and read Lovecraft now, let's just face it, he wasn't the best writer. he was terrible at dialogue, and his prose is incredibly purple. But like his ideas and how he describes but doesn't describe stuff, the way he would describe one aspect of a monster, like he would just talk about how their skin looked and felt, and that was it, and that was enough to make you go, oh gee, what the fuck does the rest of it look like?
Yeah.
And I think that has a lot to do with SCP too. Is like the best one, not all of them, but the best ones, and something I'm always trying to do is how much exact information am I going to give? There's the description of every single SCP file. That's the second part of the whole article. But how much am I really going to tell in that story? How much is going to be revealed in the addenda, and how much is just going to be implied? Like one of the other standalone ones I mentioned was 5923, and 5923 is about an abandoned town that was abandoned because of a population swap. And this actually happened between Turkey and Greece, because there were a lot of people that were Turkish that were living in Greece, and a lot of people that were Greek that were ethically, they were living in Turkey. And the two governments thought it would be better if they were with their own people. Those people did not agree, obviously. They had been living in these places for generations. Like, this was a Greek town. This is a real place. I'm not going to butcher its name by trying to pronounce it. That has been abandoned for 100 years, because for like 300 years before that, it had been these people that were ethnically Greek and had always been, and they just lived in Turkey. They always had. They lived in the Ottoman Empire before it was Turkey, and now it's, well, I guess at that point it was still the Ottoman Empire. But my point is, we're talking centuries.
Yeah.
And now it's just empty. And I got to thinking about, what is that, there's an idea on the wiki, and not just on the wiki, about the Genius Loci. I think it's Genius Loci, which is essentially like spirit of a place, right? So if Los Angeles has a spirit, it's probably a heroin addict. But, but like, there are, like, is there a spirit, an atmosphere or whatever of a spiritual nature to physical places? Like the Japanese have the idea of the kami, and like mountaintops. Sometimes there are gods that are just the kami of that mountaintop or that valley. And I got to thinking, if there was the spirit of this town and the town was abandoned, how would that affect the spirit? And so it just becomes this thing that's just reaching out to people in dreams and showing this wonderfully charming, village, and you should come here, and whatever. And when people get there, it's, it's this abandoned, it's a fairly destroyed place. And the special containment procedures are all about how the SCP Foundation is going to have to invest in tourism for the area to convince people to go and visit this area. And that's meant to be a hook. Like, people are supposed to be like, wait, that's not normally the SCP. What do they care about tourism in this small town in Turkey? And then, one of the researchers is essentially one of these people that gets hit with this dream that has like imagery of this town. And so they start trying to figure out where this town is, because if they can, get her to, identify the town, then maybe there's something in that town that's sending out these ideas. And they go back through history, and there's like famous Turkish poets and others who have been writing about this thing that's happened. So it's been happening for like a long time, but no one knows what. And it just seems to be one of those culturally, specific dreams that, just happens. Like, the fact that like, it's very common in American and other Western European societies for people to dream about showing up to class naked, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very specific social pressure that we put on children to perform, in school type situations, or, showing up to work and not knowing you had to give a presentation. There's a very specific capitalist, Western society perspective. So maybe this dream is just a very specific for this area, this culture. Well, no, it's this thing that's reaching out and trying to get people to come there. And it starts off kind of unsettling and horrifying. And then by the end of it, it's just pretty clear that this is just lonely. It just desperately wants people to come around, because it's used to people being inside it. It's a town, its only purpose is to provide a safe place for people to live and work and have families. And so the Foundation MTF person who gets kind of trapped in it is kind of in this weird, almost like Paprika's weird dreamlike world of the town. Basically just ends up suggesting, whoa, wait, I have an idea. And then you're supposed to like, and then the article ends with, and then the conprocs were updated accordingly. And so it's supposed to make you go back and look at the special containment procedures and say, oh, wow, the Foundation did like a good thing.
Okay.
Because it's cool. It's very common the Foundation does bad stuff.
Yeah. That's interesting. So it becomes a tourist destination, essentially.
Yeah. And so it's a real place, and you can look it up online, and like Wikipedia and other places will say that it is a global heritage site. I forget UNESCO or I forget what the organization is that makes that official designations, but it's actually not. It's like a lie of the local tourism, tourism for I forget the name. I actually have it in the Turkish Tourism Bureau or whatever. It's like, I think maybe at one point they maybe were up for it and they didn't get it or something, but they just like have kept that going. And like lots of websites will say it is. And then you read up on it and you go, oh no, it's not actually.
Huh.
And so I just made that part of the SCPs, like,
that's cool.
They're like, so that's real, but it's in our world, it's just because of some bullshit bureaucracy, and in the story, it's the SCP making that story up, so people come there.
That's cool. A little crossover. Before we end it, do you have any authors you want to shout out? Anything personally that you want to shout out?
Yes, totally. So I have a Twitter, at Grigori Karpin. And some of my favorite authors are like Harry Blank. You should definitely look up Harry Blank. He's like my partner in crime. He's written like twice what I've written, but he is also very interested in like character focused stuff, but like kind of funny as opposed to horror. Let's see. Placeholder, you should definitely read Placeholder's new series, his Archetypicals. He just made up I think it's the third part of that series. It's really good. I don't like pataphysics. I think pataphysics is dumb. But he makes it fun. You know, and he kills it with that stuff. The idea of like the author gods makes me bored out of my mind, but somehow he pulls it off. So it's really good. IHP, who's like a very, I don't know if he's famous, but like he's written like hundreds of articles. And he has currently, there's a series that he's writing called Black Autumn, and it's about this site in Minnesota where like a fear entity gets out, and it's a series of tales about people kind of facing their fears, but it really subverts expectations in a lot of really interesting ways. I'm trying to think of who else. Everyone should read Plague PJP. I know it's a mouthful, but it's Plague PJP. He's been very helpful with me with the Vikander-Kneed, the media stuff that I mentioned. He also wrote one, which is about like a jazzercise videotape that is cool. It's great. It's amazing. I don't remember. I can tell you the number if you give me a second. But he has this certain like tone to all his articles that is like, it's very often funny, but it's very often also just weird. Like in the best way. Like the way that like Lynch is off and weird.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's SCP-5417 is Plagues, and it's size up. 5417. Like exercise up. Almost everything he's written has been fascinating, and he's only written like 7 or 8 articles. And his partner in crime. I'm assuming
he's new, right?
He is relatively new. I'm not sure when he started though. He might have even been before me, but he just doesn't done as many. But he's read almost all of these media ones, and he's been like really involved in like just like bouncing stuff off of him, because like I said, the first like 10 things I wrote were all like about cults and gothic horror and stuff. And so talking about weird radio shows, and like I have one that's about a human resources orientation video that gets really weird. It's not my norm, and so he's helped me out with a lot of that stuff. So I would say Harry Blank, IHP, and Plague PJP. Anyone that's interested in authors, if you go to the wiki and you press on the left-hand side, you can actually bring up the author pages. And even if you're not a member, you can just look through alphabetically these different authors and just, pick one at random. Like, some of them suck, let's not kid ourselves. But, I mean, yeah, you could read DJ Cactus till you go home. And, I mean, till you fall asleep. And yeah, of course, there's a reason he's so popular. He's a very good writer. But there's a lot of really, really interesting stuff. And like we were talking about earlier, horror often attracts, like, pretty original thinkers. So, yeah, go read some of these small guys.
Links in the description for those of you guys who are too lazy to go on the site and look at the author pages. Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.